little looser because there's no support through the middle. It's only like 1-inch iron across the. All right, here we go. Good evening. We're gonna get going here. We're gonna start out with "Ain't No Rock." Ain't no rock, gonna stand in my place as long as I'm alive to glorify His holy name. Ain't no rock, gonna stand in my place as long as I'm alive to glorify His holy name. Come on and praise His holy name. As long as I'm alive to glorify His holy name. Come on and praise His holy name. As long as I'm alive to glorify His holy name. Ain't no tree gonna lift its branches. I lift my hands to glorify His holy name. Ain't no tree gonna lift its branches. I lift my hands to glorify His holy name. Come on and praise His holy name. As long as I'm alive to glorify His holy name. Come on and praise His holy name. As long as I'm alive to glorify His holy name. Ain't no bird gonna sing in my place. I lift my voice to glorify His holy name. Ain't no bird gonna sing in my place. I lift my voice to glorify His holy name. Come on and praise His holy name. As long as I'm alive to glorify His holy name. Well, come on and praise His holy name. As long as I'm alive to glorify His holy name. Ain't no rock, no tree, no bug gonna stand in my place. As long as I'm alive to glorify His holy name. Ain't no rock, no tree, no bug gonna stand in my place. As long as I'm alive to glorify His holy name. Well, come on and praise His holy name. As long as I'm alive to glorify His holy name. Well, come on and praise His holy name. As long as I'm alive to glorify His holy name. God, everything's all right. Everything's all right in my Father's house. Whoa, in my Father's house. Whoa, in my Father's house. Everything's all right in my Father's house. Where there's joy, joy, joy. Come and go with me to my Father's house. Whoa, to my Father's house. Whoa, to my Father's house. Come and go with me to my Father's house. Where there's joy, joy, joy. Jesus is the way to my Father's house. Whoa, to my Father's house. Whoa, to my Father's house. Jesus is the way to my Father's house. Where there's joy, joy, joy. There are many rooms in my Father's house. Whoa, in my Father's house. Whoa, in my Father's house. There are many rooms in my Father's house. Where there's joy, joy, joy. Peace and happiness there in my Father's house. Whoa, in my Father's house. Whoa, in my Father's house. Peace and happiness there in my Father's house. Where there's joy, joy, joy. I feel good. I feel good, good, good. I feel good, oh yes, my Lord, because there's something about the Spirit of Jesus that makes me feel good, 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 good. I feel love, love, love. I feel love, oh yes, my Lord, because there's something about the Spirit of Jesus that makes me feel love, 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 love. I feel joy, joy, joy. I feel joy, oh yes, my Lord, because there's something about the Spirit of Jesus that makes me feel joy, 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 joy. I feel peace, peace, peace. I feel peace, oh yes, my Lord, because there's something about the Spirit of Jesus that makes me feel peace, 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 peace. All right, we got Whose Side Are You Living On? Tell me, whose side are you living on?
I'm living on the Lord's side.
Tell me, whose side are you living on?
I'm living on the Lord's side.
I'm living on the Lord's side. I'm living on the Lord's side. Tell me, whose side are you singing on?
I'm singing on the Lord's side.
Tell me, whose side are you singing on?
I'm singing on the Lord's side.
I'm singing on the Lord's side. I'm singing on the Lord's side. Tell me, whose side are you praying on?
I'm praying on the Lord's side.
Tell me, whose side are you praying on?
I'm praying on the Lord's side.
I'm praying on the Lord's side. I'm praying on the Lord's side. Tell me, whose side are you loving on?
I'm loving on the Lord's side.
Tell me, whose side are you loving on?
I'm loving on the Lord's side.
I'm loving on the Lord's side. I'm loving on the Lord's side. You'll be seated.
Let us faithfully continue to pray for our brothers and sisters who need healing. Nick Mindson, Emily Ninsdale, baby Nathan, Jenny Richards, Doug's brother, Mark, Don Stowers, Gwen Gilbert, Thomas Matthias, Stacy Kenny's mother, and Nikolai's father and grandmother. Pickleball. I did not know what this was until recently. Matt Isabel is coordinating a pickleball group. This group will play once a month on Saturdays at 10 a.m. RSVP to Matt or through the RSVP links on the website by Sunday. Because I don't know anything about pickleball, I don't know where that is. Tom Brown. Valentine's Murder Mystery Dinner is this Saturday, February 10th at 4 o'clock. If you are serving for the event, please be there by 3:15. CrossWay Fitness met last night for the first time, and Allison taught an amazing class. If you missed it, make sure you put next Tuesday at 5:30 on your calendar. John Groves will be leading a 6-mile hike through Turea State Park Saturday, February 17th. The group will meet here at 8 a.m. to carpool. Please RSVP to John Groves or on the website. Kickball and subs. Encompass has rescheduled kickball. This event is for everyone, whether you play or just come hang out and cheer them on. Come out Sunday after church, Tom Brown Park, 1:30. Sub sandwich picnic provided, so please RSVP to Jessica Johnson or on the website. And the retreat. Retreat is 3 weeks from this Sunday. The numbers for rooms and food are due soon. Today, you should have received a text about volunteering at the retreat. This is like a family vacation, so check the link to see how you can volunteer. Hannah is working hard to make sure that we have a fully staffed kids town so our young families can come and participate in the retreat. We can only prepare if we know who's coming. RSVP. ASAP. If you have any questions, contact Jenny. Are there any birthdays? No. Anniversaries? No. They're trying to decide. Next week. All right.
Do we want to stand up today and make her sing or not? It's next week. It's next week. What's that? We'll do it next week. It is this week. You're right.
All right. Good evening. Hello, hello, hello. Testing. 1, 2, testing. I was going to say good morning,
because I'm used to saying good morning, but it's not morning. It's morning somewhere. Before we get started, let's pray real quick. Father God, thank you for giving us another opportunity where we can come together as a church, as a body, learn about you, learn about each other, grow closer to you and to each other. Help us to have a wonderful service that glorifies you this evening, and help me speak the words that you give me tonight. In your Son's name I pray. Amen. So, before we get started in the actual continuation of what I talked about on Sunday, I do have to start with a clarification. And so, this very beginning is going to be active. So, did anybody catch a mistake that I made on Sunday? I know Jenny probably caught it because her husband caught it. Anybody else catch a mistake? Joe, what was my mistake? Right. So that's one of the mistakes. So so in the New Testament, how many kind of accounts of resurrections did we have? New Testament. I counted 7. Okay, so in Luke 7, the widow's son. Luke 8, Jairus' daughter. Jairus' daughter. John 11, Lazarus. The saints of Jerusalem went during the time of the crucifixion. Tabitha, resurrected by Peter in Acts 9. I don't know how to pronounce this. Eutychus by Paul in Acts 20. And then, of course, Jesus himself being the main one that I was referring to. So my mistake, obviously, that is the single person being... Oh, by the way, these slides will be sent out via digital format. There was a small part of me that thought about printing them, but I decided that probably wouldn't make sense because there's like 40 of them or something. But anyway, so that's the list that I came up with. I think that's correct. I don't know, are there any others that you can think of, Chris? Okay, so that's correction number 1. Correction number 2, there's another thing that I said that probably isn't exactly correct. Did anybody else catch that one? So I said that Psalms 22 was written about 500, 600 years before Jesus. Psalms is attributed to King David. And there's some disagreements. I was trying to find a very clear description, but most people attribute him to King David, which would mean it would be 1,000 years before Jesus. At a minimum, this was what I was able to find. At a minimum, it was definitely written before the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC. So, did I say 50? Well, that's really wrong then. Did I really? I couldn't have said 50 years. Okay, well, that was really wrong then. Either way, the point is, Psalms were written way before Jesus was born, and so when that book or that section of Psalms talks about crucifixion, talks about Jesus and his whole suffering in that process, is really staggering and really amazing. So those are the 2 corrections I wanted to give before we jumped into the continuation. So we're talking about being rooted in evidence, and today my plan is to discuss some of the evidences that go beyond just what the Bible says. I mentioned one of those, and we'll talk about him a little bit further today. But I want to also ask, why do you believe in the Bible? Anybody remember my big spiel that I said? I'm going to repeat it. So I want to just reiterate it. The Bible is a reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses. During the life of other eyewitnesses, they wrote about supernatural events that occurred in fulfillment of specific prophecies, and they claim that their words were divine rather than human in origin. So, I don't know, I love that. It summarizes a lot of where my brain has now shifted, and I feel pretty confident to be able to discuss the ideas of some of these evidences and some of these proofs. Now, I may not be the all-knowing, and I may not be able to answer questions, but I know that I can find that answer now and be confident at least with the information that I do know. So today's point is really not to because we just don't have enough time. but today's point is to create a little bit of a summary of some of the other resources that we can see, some of the other evidences that we see, other people that discussed Jesus, that wrote about him, other ways that we can know that the Bible is reliable, that it's consistent, that it's trustworthy. So this should really serve as more of a guide than kind of an all-inclusive list. There is far more evidence than what this little piece of paper says, but it gives us a little bit of an outline. It gives you some space that if you wanted to write some notes. And so I picked out 3 specific archaeological points that I thought were really interesting, and then there's a few historians and other writers, authors that discuss Jesus and a few other points. So with that in mind, let's jump into some of the archaeological tidbits. So a quote that I found interesting: "It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference." And so if you dig into the evidences, and at the bottom of this page and at the end of the slides is a list of the resources that I was looking at, in addition to some other ones that I addressed. But if you start looking at it, and if you start comparing, because the way this all started for me was I took and I started reading some atheist writers, and I was like, as I started reading, and I was like, all right, there's a point. Let me disprove that point, okay? They made another point, I disproved that point. Made another point, disproved that point. And I got to a point where I was reading some of these atheist writers, and I was like, these guys are just talking hot air. They're not really making any sense. Their arguments are really not. They don't have any backing or structure behind their arguments. And so that's true with the archaeological discoveries. These 3 specific archaeological things that I want to bring up today are just 3, but it goes into, if you dive into it, you'll see stuff about geography. You'll see discoveries that showed the different locations that are discussed in the Bible. Things that people thought, like, oh, this place doesn't really exist. Well, more recent discoveries have showed that those locations are real. So the first one is a confirmation of the crucifixion. So up until fairly recently, it was thought of that really the only evidence that we had for crucifixion was what was written either in the Bible or people like Josephus, who was a Jewish historian that we'll talk about. It was all based on literary work. There was no archaeological evidence really that said, oh wow, there's the crucifixion, that it was real. And so what we have is fairly recently, in June 1968, an archaeologist, Sepphoris, I think that's how you pronounce his name. He discovered 4 cave tombs north of Jerusalem. And this is thought to be a group of family tombs, or family members would have been buried together. They dated back to late 2nd century BC to 70 AD, so right smack in the time of when Jesus would have had his ministry. And there's a picture that's going to come up, and it's, I don't know if it's gruesome, but here's what they found. You can throw the picture up. So in that cave, what you had was the bones of an individual who had obviously been buried. One thing that they noticed was that he had a 7-inch iron spike through his heel. And so up to this point, people argued that, this was one of the arguments that they came up with, there was no way that Jesus would have been crucified or was resurrected. These were all these different arguments because, number one, was they said people that were crucified weren't nailed to a cross. They were hung by ropes. That was one argument. Another argument was that they said when criminals were crucified, then they weren't buried afterwards. They were just tossed, or they were left on the cross to be eaten by birds and animals to rot away, or they were tossed into a pit, not able to be buried. Well, this threw those arguments right over, because what you have here is you have a family burial tomb. You have an individual that was obviously crucified. One of the other things that they found in this tomb was that his shin bones were also broken. And so Chris will discuss more about the specifics from a medical perspective on crucifixion, but one of the things that the Roman soldiers would do was they would break the victims' shins to make them die faster if they haven't died. So this archaeological discovery showed that crucifixion was real. They used nails, not just ropes, to do it. People that were crucified were potentially then buried. And the breaking of shin bones by Roman soldiers was a real practice. So, interesting. Another discovery that I found fun to think about. One of the main characters in the biblical account in the Gospels associated with Jesus is Pontius Pilate. And until fairly recently, again, kind of like the crucifixion, most of the evidence that surrounded Pontius Pilate was in writings. They didn't have a clear archaeological evidentiary space. They didn't have anything that said that this guy existed other than what was written either in the Gospels or written by other authors. Well, until 1961, when they did an excavation of the port city of Caesarea. This was a part of the area that served as the Roman capital. They uncovered what's dubbed the Pilate Stone. And so there's a picture, I think it's the next slide. What you have on the Pilate Stone is interesting. So this stone basically has writing on it, and it says that there's a kind of crude translation of it, but this Tiberium is presented to Pontius Pilate, or presented by Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. So all of a sudden, you have a physical stone that corroborated that Pontius Pilate lived, that he was a prefect of Judea, that he was a ruler of the ruling class, and then he was a real person. So another interesting archaeological discovery that I found pretty interesting. The last archaeological tidbit or evidence that I want to bring up is the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the Qumran Cave Scrolls. So these were a series, or a huge collection, actually, I think 15,000 manuscripts discovered between 1946 and 1956. And what these were is a collection of ancient Jewish manuscripts that have been dated to about the 3rd century BC through the 1st century AD. So they were copies of older documents, and their dates were, 200-300 years before Jesus into that 1st century. And the thought behind all of these, there's a huge record. You can dive into all the details of how many different scrolls there are. The picture that was put up there is how they were stored. They were stored in these jars in a cave, and they were preserved for basically 2,000 years. The thought was that the people that put them in the cave were trying to preserve that history. They wanted those scrolls to be preserved probably during the time of the First Jewish-Roman War, 66 to 74 AD. So they sat there in the cave. They were discovered, and the big thing that is amazing about these scrolls, or these manuscripts were found, is that the entirety of the Old Testament, with the exception of the book of Esther, is found in that collection, in addition to all sorts of other writings. But to us, and from this perspective that we're talking about, that's probably one of the most important aspects of it, because prior to this collection, the oldest manuscripts that we had of those Old Testament writings would have gone to about the 9th century. So 900 years after, more or less, after Jesus died, we found these scrolls, and all of a sudden, these documents predate Jesus. And so when it comes to the argument that somebody would have gone in and written, say, the example of Psalms 22 that we're talking about, they went in and they wrote a poem to manufacture something, make it look like it was supposed to be there. It actually was written way before Jesus was born. And so that's one of the significant parts. The other part of these Dead Sea Scrolls that's important to us is that you're able to look at the copies that are 1,000 years older than the previous. So we went back 1,000 years more and got a copy that was accurate to what we had before. So before we had the 9th century documents that were like, okay, we think this is reliable. Now we go back 1,000 years more, and they're still the same documents. And so we can know that what we read in our Bible is what was written in the Bible, is what people preached, is what people talked about, what God inspired. So it wasn't modified, it wasn't changed over 1,000-year period, which when you think about 1,000 years, it's very easy to say, it was 1,000 years ago that these were written, but when you really think about 1,000 years, that's amazing. So, we're going to move, maybe able to finish pretty quick here. I want to jump into non-biblical persons of interest. These are some of the people, because when I was studying originally, and even more recently, I always have this tendency to say, well, can't prove, I don't believe this anymore because of all the wealth of knowledge now that I've been reading and studying, but you can't prove the Bible by reading the Bible or quoting the Bible to say that the Bible is true, unless you understand why the Bible was written, how it was written, and some of the evidence behind the Bible. So I always ask this question, like, who wrote about Jesus, or who wrote about biblical accounts that aren't in the Bible? Because the argument is that, well, people that don't know will say that there's no evidence for Jesus, for example, because the only evidence is in the Bible. Well, that's not true. So there's two people that I want to first bring up. One, his name is Thallus, and he lived from about 5 to 60 AD. So this guy is really old in terms of history. We actually don't have any of his own writings, but one of the important quotes that we do have is from 2021 AD by Sextus Julius Africanus. And what he wrote was this: on the whole world there passed a most fearful darkness. The rocks were rent by earthquakes, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness Thallus, in his 3rd book of his history, calls, as it appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. So Africanus is saying, Thallus thought this was an eclipse of the sun. So in this account, we're able to see that there was something outside of the Bible that said during the time of the crucifixion, darkness fell over the world. There was earthquakes. In this case, Thallus was thinking that it was not supernatural, but we have a source of documenting this event that's outside the Bible. In a similar fashion, a guy named Phlegon, from 80 to 140 AD, similar way, he was quoted by this guy, Origen of Alexandria. What he wrote was, at the time of Tiberius Caesar, that there was a full moon, there was a full eclipse of the sun from the 6th to the 9th hour. And one of the things that he said, that Phlegon also said, was that Jesus had knowledge of future events. So it doesn't necessarily tell us a lot, but it does corroborate that people knew that there was a Jesus. They observed that beyond just the biblical account of the crucifixion, we have that there was darkness that came over the world. And at the time, especially the people that were not associated with Christianity, didn't understand it, attributed it to some kind of natural event rather than supernatural, which is what we know it to be. Moving along. We're familiar, a lot of people are familiar with this guy, Josephus. Josephus is thought of as really probably one of the most important historians when discussing antiquity. He was a Jewish historian. He worked under Roman Emperor Flavius Vespasian. He actually found his way into that job because prior to Vespasian becoming, this is the account that I was reading. Prior to Vespasian becoming emperor, he was a general, and he spared Josephus's life when Josephus said that he could see a prophecy that Vespasian was going to become emperor. And he said, all right, let me keep you. And he brought him in as a slave, and then he allowed him to write a Jewish history, trying to document that for the Roman Empire. And so he's considered as a chief source, next to the Bible itself, of ancient Israel. He wrote a couple major books that people would look at. One is called The Jewish War, which recounted the Jewish revolt against Roman occupation. And he wrote Antiquities of the Jews, recounting the history of the world from the Jewish perspective. And this is one of the quotes that is really interesting. At this time, there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous, and many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, and those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. Josephus is interesting because you read some of these documents, and all of these people aren't Christians. They weren't looking to corroborate the story of Jesus, but by their writings, when you read them, and the fact that they're making note of Jesus or making note of seemingly natural eclipses, they're writing and they're corroborating the story that we have in the gospel itself. And so from this account that Josephus wrote, what we have is that Jesus lived. That's number one. That he was thought of as a wise man and a virtuous teacher who had wondrous powers. He was crucified by Pontius Pilate. He had followers that reported him alive after the fact, and he was thought of as being the Messiah. All of which, when we read the gospel accounts, this is the image that we get of Jesus. Again, coming from a source that is not Christian. On Sunday, I talked about a guy, and I quoted him, and we'll quote him again, Tacitus. Tacitus lived from 56 to 117 AD. Again, he's another trusted historian. In this case, he's a Roman historian. And he wrote a history of Rome. And he is thought of as being one of the main sources for understanding early Roman Empire, so the first century Roman Empire. The quote that I read on Sunday, I'm going to read it again. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of evil, but in Rome. And so the language of it is a little bit different than what we're used to, but what he's saying is Emperor Nero, when he started persecuting, started killing Christians, and he blamed these fires in Rome on the Christians. He tortured Christians. These people that were called Christians, they followed Christus, from whose name they found. You see, this was done during the reign of Tiberius. So, you have Pontius Pilate coming into play. He discusses this mischievous superstition, which would be referring to Christianity or to our faith in Christ. And then the fact that for a moment they thought they had squashed it, but that Christianity continued on beyond. In some way, seemingly to be annoying to the author, is how I read it. So Jesus lived in Judea. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. His followers were persecuted for their faith. Another source that is not Christian writing about Jesus Christ. There's another guy, Pliny the Younger, from 61 to 113 AD. This guy was a lawyer, he was an author, he was a magistrate in Rome. So he had connections to some of the officials, he had connections, and he exchanged letters with people that were higher up in government. And one of these exchanges that we have record of, that I want to point out, was a letter to Emperor Trajan. And he wrote about the worship practices of the early Christians. And this is what he wrote. They were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses and hymns to Christ, as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath, not to do any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, adultery, never to falsify their words, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up, after which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. So I like this section. When you read it, you think of all the instructions that we get in the Gospels, in the New Testament, about how we're supposed to live as Christians, what we're supposed to do, what we're supposed to avoid. And here you have an account written by a Roman official saying that these Christians did exactly that. They were living this really strange life, doing things and worshiping Christ as if he was a god, which we know he is God. And they did this. They also ended up taking communion together. So in response to this letter that he wrote to Trajan, Trajan then responded with a decree. And so what he said, this is an interesting one to me, because one of the things I've always heard about growing in my faith was how the Christians were able, if they only said, "You're right, this is all a lie, I don't believe it," their lives would have been spared. And so this is partially where this comes from. Trajan said that all Christians are supposed to be punished to the fullest extent for their worship practices, unless they denounce their faith. And then in that case, they can be fully pardoned. So it's really interesting perspective. And when you think about, you read that and you say, okay, this is where all this came from. And what did the different early church fathers, and we'll talk about it further, do? They were willing to die for what they knew to be true. And all they had to do based on this was to say, no, I don't believe it, and I'll stop worshiping that way. I'm sorry. These early church Christians, early disciples, were that committed and that sold out for the message that they weren't willing to bend, even though they totally could and spare their life. Yes. Can you go back 2 slides? Go forward one. Yeah. Right. Because they had to be secure. Yeah. That's a good point. Right. No. So I wouldn't be able to. Chris might have more comment on some of that, but for sure, there's no doubt. If you think about what they were experiencing, especially under Nero, the last thing you'd want to do is be killed for singing. And so, yeah, they found a way to do it. To me, it's pretty neat, too, because, we have some of that tradition now. We meet on Sunday mornings. Maybe we should be meeting before sunrise? I don't know. Probably not. I don't think people would be too happy with that. But you can see their dedication to the cause. You can see, and this isn't from a biblical source, but you see the dedication to the teachings, dedication to each other. One of the things that we're going to be talking about when we get to the retreat is community, fellowship together, working together, being in the body. That's actually my talk on Sunday morning is going to be related to that. So I love it. I love seeing these sources that discuss these things that we've been taught to do and follow and propagate. Next source, the Talmud. So I can't claim to be a huge authority on understanding exactly how this works, because to me, this is a fairly new piece of literary work that I was trying to dig into a bit. And so maybe, Chris, if you have any comments as I talk about it. But basically, the Talmud is in Judaism, you have basically a way that was all of these rabbis and their discussions and their communication and their teachings were recorded and they're considered sacred, and they're basically they're the foundation of the laws and how people within that faith are supposed to function. And so what you have is you have this record from the 5th century. There's two different ones. One from the 5th century, where they were discussing Jesus. And so these are in essence, the way I envisioned it was you have a scribe that kind of wrote down what these people were talking about, and then it was formalized, and it was then created to be the lesson that is taught to future generations of Jewish people. And so what you have is there are several different examples. I think I put 2 quotes in here. One is this: "It was taught on the day before the Passover, they hanged Jesus. A herald went before him for 40 days, proclaiming he will be stoned because he practiced magic and enticed Israel to go astray. Let anyone who knows anything in his favor come forward and plead for him. But nothing was found in his favor, and they hanged him on this day before the Passover." And so this is written in this collection of official documents, and they say that there was a Jesus. We actually created a situation where they were planning on killing him, basically is what it's saying. And then we went ahead, and because nobody could find evidence or support his cause, he was then hung on the cross before Passover. And I think I didn't do the other quote. There's another quote that basically attributes to the Talmud, where they're talking about Jesus as an individual who led Israel astray. And there's several examples of it. But basically what they're discussing and trying to promote through these formal documents is drawing an image of Jesus as being a sorcerer, a person that turned people away from Judaism, somebody that you don't want to follow. That kind of image is portrayed in these recordings of these conversations. Chris, did you have anything beyond that you want? It's kind of a simple summary of it. Like I said, there's a lot that you can dig into, but what's interesting about it is that this is again, not biblical text, but it's supporting Jesus as a historical figure. It's supporting Jesus doing supernatural, maybe sorcery or magic is what they thought of, that he was a magician, things that we read in the gospel accounts. So it's corroborating, it's showing that sure enough, outside of the Bible itself, we have evidence that this stuff actually happened. Yeah, so in the process of trying to squash Jesus as somebody to follow or somebody to look after, they actually reiterated all of the stuff that we read in the Bible and the gospel accounts as why we need to be following him and what is so amazing about him. You can jump ahead a couple slides there. So to me, and you can dig into just, books and books and books and novels and scrolls. If you know how to read Latin or Greek or Hebrew, then the sources just explode to you. That if you want to dig into it, and I would encourage you to dig into it. Langley will know, I've basically every night I've been reading something surrounding all of this, and in some capacity, it's pretty overwhelming to get the pieces to fit. But it's really amazing how much evidence there really is for Jesus as a historical figure, for the miracles that he performed, the events surrounding it. If you want to dig into Old Testament and see the prophecies and look at a historical record of when some of these events with different kingdoms, like the book of Daniel would be a good one, when you had these different kingdoms and empires come into play and how they line up and how they stack, just like the Bible accounts show, is interesting. One of the things to me from an evidence perspective is something that I don't know when I first started discussing it, but it would have been a long time ago. But this was one of the reasons that I thought the biblical account is amazing and real and truthful, and that's the people that were martyred for their faith. So let me get my things straight here. Okay, so Polycarp. Polycarp is an interesting fellow. He was one of the first church fathers outside of the apostles. He walked side by side with John. He was a disciple, John. He was a disciple of John. So he had firsthand knowledge of what the gospel said, what happened. And as you think about this, if you have an individual that had direct contact with the early church, he had direct contact with apostles. He wrote letters to some of these different churches in Ephesians, or in Ephesus, I believe, in Corinth, I believe, is another one that he wrote. But he wrote letters to these different churches. He was involved in growing and creating in essence, a theology that we follow, how the church structure. Super important figure in early church history. And what you have in Polycarp is that he had the connections, he had the people, he had the knowledge base to be able to decipher and know whether something is real or not real. I was trying to think of an example in my life, and what I thought about was and this isn't saying that Chris is an apostle, but having Chris as a leader of our church, and I am now walking side by side with Chris. I've known Chris for 25 years. I know his family. I know who his kids are. I know what he teaches. I know some of the his life events that would have come up that have shaped him. I've seen pictures of his family members. I know stories that he's talked about. I know who he is. If Chris was in that boat and in that time, and he was able to say, "This is what happened," I could look at his life and I know him as a primary source, and I would be able to tell whether or not what he's talking about is made up. And that's what you have in Polycarp. And that's what you have in a lot of the early church fathers. When you look through the list, you had this chain of discipleship where one discipled another, which if you've been in this church for a while, that's one of the big things that we're trying to push, is this kind of one-on-one discipleship process. And so if if I take somebody and I help them learn about Jesus, I help them learn about the Bible, I help them become baptized, and then they go to the next person, but you develop this really strong bond, and through that time frame, you're going to be able to know whether what you're talking about is true or not. And so Polycarp was in this position where he was able to recant. He was able to say, this is real or this is not real. This is made up or this is not made up. And he was faithful. This is the quote that he said, 80 and 6 years have I served him, and he hath done me no wrong. How can I speak evil of my king who saved me? And he died a martyr's death. He was burned at the stake. One account said that he was burned at the stake and then stabbed because he wasn't actually engulfed in flames, which I thought was an interesting way of describing what happened to him. But for 86 years, he was like, are you kidding me? I can't say no. This is real. This is what happened. Now, that's the case with pretty much all the apostles. Paul was beheaded by Nero, is the account that I saw. I came across where becomes a little bit tricky to find the true way of death, I guess, but because sources change and people have different perspectives. But basically, 11 of the 12 apostles were killed for their faith. They were martyred for their faith. So the source I had that Paul was beheaded. Peter was crucified upside down because he said, I couldn't die the same death that my Savior died. And he said, so he got crucified upside down. Andrew was crucified. Thomas was crucified. James, son of Zebedee, beheaded. Philip was cruelly put to death. Matthew was stabbed. Bartholomew martyred. James, son of Alphaeus, stoned and clubbed to death. Simon the Zealot killed for his faith. Matthias, who was the replacement for Judas, also martyred. John is thought to be the only one that didn't die for his faith, and he died of old age. So when you think about this, you think about Polycarp, there's others. They were willing to die for this. Now, people say, oh, people die for a lie all the time, but nobody dies for something that you know to be a lie. And that's the amazing part with this tidbit of information is the apostles, the firsthand eyewitnesses, these people that were around Jesus, they held his hand, they walked with him, they were discipled by him, they were taught by him, they were there. When they had an opportunity to denounce their faith and they had an opportunity to be able to be spared, they didn't. They stayed firm on their faith and conviction about who Jesus was. And to me, that's a really, really telling piece of evidence in itself. If you're willing to die for something, you don't think of it as being a lie. If you knew it was a lie, you wouldn't be willing to die for it. So I'd encourage you guys to dig into some of these pieces of information further. There's a list at the bottom of the page that has a lot of the books that I used. The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict is awesome, but it's like this thick. Really good resource. There's a couple that were smaller books that the same author made or wrote. The bottom three, the New Testament documents, are they reliable? By F.F. Bruce. Is My Bible the Inspired Word of God? By Goodrick. How We Got the Bible and Why We Can Trust It? By Taliaferro. Those are really small reads. And if you want something that you can like jump through and it's got snippets, those books are really easy to get to. If you want more of a textbook type read, the New Evidence That Demands a Verdict would be that one. I had to include a verse because I had to. And so the verse that popped into my mind over the last 5-6 weeks of me prepping for the sermon and prepping for this class was this idea that we're supposed to ask, we're supposed to be inquisitive, we're supposed to be willing to do the research and get a better understanding of why we have this faith. And so Matthew 7, verse 7, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, the door will be opened. One of the things that I admire, I've always admired Chris for, is that perspective, going back to when I was in high school and he started introducing Christianity to me. The thing that he always did was he gave me something to research, something to look at. If I had a question, the encouragement was, go find out more about it. Or here's an answer that I know, go look at it more. Here's a resource that you need to follow. If you're in a place where you're not solid on your faith, you're not solid on your understanding of why you're coming here on Wednesdays and Sundays, I would encourage you to jump on that. I know that the last 5 weeks for me have been really strong faith building. It's been really, really amazing for me. I'm really excited about the future in that regard. There's a few places where I was like, man, I would love to dig into this account, or I want to know more about the history of Nero. I want to know more about Josephus and his writings, or looking at the geography and looking at the locations and where they are, or even one day, probably not right now, but one day making a trip to that part of the world and seeing the physical parts of the, this era in humanity. What I want to leave you with is this: we do not have to approach our spirituality with blind faith. Nor do we have to be intimidated when someone makes an attempt to discredit our faith and understanding. It's very easy to be in that place where if you don't have an answer, you fold. The reality is there is an answer, and it's probably not that difficult to find. Somebody that tries to discredit it probably hasn't looked deep enough, is what I know. In my previous mindset, operated as. I had an opinion about what God is, what the Bible is, and it was just that. It was an opinion. It wasn't founded on anything. And that's the case in a lot of situations where you come across somebody arguing the Bible, because if they actually look at the accounts, if they actually look at the evidence, if they actually look at what is written about it outside of the Bible, inside of the Bible, it's hard to discredit it. You come to the conclusion that it's reliable, that it's consistent, that it's trustworthy. Jesus was a real man that did some amazing supernatural things in fulfillment of prophecies from centuries prior. He's the most important human figure. He's the most important figure in human history, and we should lean our life on his teachings and example of his life. With that, I'm going to read my statement one more time because I like it. The Bible is a reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses during the life of other eyewitnesses. They wrote about supernatural events that occurred in fulfillment of specific prophecies, and they claim that their words were divine rather than human in origin. Thank you.
I just want to add a couple of things for all of us, because Nikolai didn't know all this information. We talked about evidences a lot, but it's there for you. And don't let the world intimidate you with not being able to speak up for things. The first scripture he started out was the 1 Peter 3:15, that we should all be able to give an account of what and why we believe it. And it's really important for each one of us. You don't know when you're going to be challenged or when you're going to have an opportunity to say, this is real. So don't feel like that's just a teacher's role. In a sense, scripturally, we are all teachers. And this information is very available to you. And it may be intimidating to start thinking about it, but I encourage you every year to take a book on some type of evidence, whether it's things that we're going to be talking about in the next few weeks, whether it's the Bible, but there's a lot of evidence. You don't have to be intimidated by what people say is in the Bible because most people don't know. But you can learn the evidences, and there's so much more, as Nikolai was saying, that is available for you. It doesn't like you have to teach a class to people, but you need to be able to say, I know the Bible is real because of this. These few things, and it doesn't take that much, so don't feel like you can't do this. One of the reasons, there's two main reasons we're doing this, for you and I to grow in our faith, because I don't care who you are, me and all of us, and Satan will attack your faith at some time or other in your life. And if you can go back and you say, no, I know what's true. Whenever I've had doubts, I'm like, okay, I know what is exactly true, and it dismisses. But if you don't have the ability to do that, this can tangle up your heart for a long time. And the second thing is the world needs to know, and it's our job, that Jesus is real and that the scriptures are real. People do not believe that in our culture anymore. That's not someone else's job to do. It's disciples. And so really dig in, don't be afraid of it. Pick up a book. It's not that hard. It's fun. Actually, as Nikolai's talked about, you learn something new. It's exciting, whether it's in your Bible or things about the Bible. It's a time to grow. And I really am proud of Nikolai because he's grown a lot through this. And all of us have benefited. So again, thank you so much for your work and effort. Langley, sorry he was, running. He wasn't paying attention all the time. No, but I'm really thankful for that. It's an example for all of us. We can do that. So have a great fellowship. But again, thanks, Nikolai.